the U.S. Department of Education and Department of Justice in 2015 issued a Dear Colleague letter, which is, guidance to school districts um, and families. That is it's probably my favorite guidance ever that's ever been, government, guidance that's been issued. As Ariana described, I'm an education attorney, and I work primarily with immigrant and multilingual families in education access issues. And I'm also a parent myself of two children who have disabilities and who are in the IEP process. So um, I have, although this is what I do for a living, I am challenged at times in supporting my own children and kind of taking care of myself as I advocate for my children in the special education process. It's hugely challenging, and I don't have the language barriers that many of my clients have. I grew up in the United States. I went to US schools, from the time that I was in kindergarten. And so um, I love my work. In many ways, I can relate to a lot of the families, and in a lot of the ways a lot of different ways I also have to recognize just the enormous barriers that many of them face navigating the process. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because Esther did such a fabulous job describing some of the context for immigrant and multilingual families in education, students and families. Um, and I know in Massachusetts right now, we have a lot of newly arrived families as well who have experienced trauma either in their home countries prior to arriving to the United States, maybe during on their journey to Massachusetts or to the United States, and experience just a lot of barriers to accessing just life opportunities and kind of having basic needs met in some cases in the community, and also, of course, in education. And moving to the law, in the United States, we do have a federal right to public education that exists regardless of immigration status and regardless of disability. And that right stems from three principal key pieces of law that we have: two Supreme Court decisions, Plyler v. Doe, which establishes a right to public education for immigrant children, including those without documents; Lau v. Nichols, another Supreme Court decision, which establishes the requirement to provide English learner instruction to overcome language barriers for multilingual learners or for English learners; and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which establishes the right to a free and appropriate public education for students with disabilities. So a lot of the information that I will share in this webinar stems back to these really key pieces of law that we have in the United States. And this is kind of important to note. And when we're doing training with parents, we always emphasize this right to education because many of the families that we may be working with aren't familiar with education as a right, depending on the laws in their home country. So it may be something that is new to them. And here we have just an overview of the special education process, starting with the referral for a special education evaluation, and the timelines that are so key to ensuring that students receive the special education services and supports that they need in a timely way. The special education team meeting, and then the issuance of the IEP and the parent's response to the IEP. And the federal laws have the timelines may differ somewhat depending on the state that you're in. And what are listed here are the federal timelines. In Massachusetts, for example, the timelines are shorter for issuance of the IEP. Something that is crucially important that we always emphasize is the importance of parent participation in the special education process. It's really foundational for students to receive the appropriate services and supports that they need to be able to learn in school. And this is recognized under the law that parents are equal team members to the school district staff in terms of determining the needs of their children with disabilities. All written letters, forms, and meetings must be in their primary language. Um, so they must be translated into the parent's primary language and provided in English in case that the parent is working with a service provider in the community. And the school district must provide qualified interpreters. It's according to federal guidance, it's not enough that the person providing the interpretation services be bilingual. That person must also have some training in the ethics of interpretation, confidentiality, the specialized terminology that's used in special education settings, and that they be competent to serve in the role of interpreter. Unlike in medical settings, the challenge here, unlike in medical settings and in court settings, in educational settings, there aren't established training programs for training educational interpreters. There's been a lot of work that's been done by NATISL, which is I should have written this down, a national organization that contracted actually with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to develop a training curriculum for school interpreters, including interpreters that need training at the high level that an interpreter would need to be able to serve in that role for a special education team meeting where there is that terminology, and it is so crucial that the parent be able to participate in decisions about their children's education. The special education process, of course, requires parental consent at certain key points in the process before the school district can move ahead. And that's where so much of what Esther spoke about in terms of family engagement, um, building relationships with family, involving members of that parent's community to the extent that it's possible, to come to an understanding about um, that their child may have a disability and that special education is designed to support their child so that they can make progress in school and ultimately become successful as adults and as independent as possible within their potential as adults. Um, Parent response is needed to the proposed IEP and placement, of course, before that IEP can be implemented. Um, Another area in the special education process, and this is a really complicated process as I've talked about, and I'm really just highlighting areas that implicate certain rights or certain considerations for immigrant and multilingual students. Um, So school districts are legally required to identify students with disabilities in a timely way, which is referred to as child find. And this includes students who are multilingual, if if they have a suspected disability. So if for families, especially who are coming from a different country, if their children are a little bit older, it's so important to engage with families regarding their experiences with education in their home country. Did they struggle at all in school, which would have been, in their home language? What were some of the strategies that were used? Was there any testing? Were there any evaluations done, or any concerns that were raised? prior to the student coming to the United States. And then once they're here, um, it, you know, paying attention to how that student responds, um, in terms of their English language acquisition, and how it may be typical or atypical of other students who are also learning English. The testing that the school district must conduct must be in the form or language most likely to accurately assess what the child knows and can do academically, developmentally, and functionally. So if that testing has to be done in that student's native language for that student to be able to show what they're able to do, what their levels are at in terms of their academics, in terms of their functional skills and developmentally, then the school district must provide that testing in the student's native language. Testing must take into account cultural and linguistic differences, so it must also be non-discriminatory. So in terms of questions, related to the being trapped inside during a snowstorm and shoveling out the driveway, is kind of the typical example of a test question that might be discriminatory and might disadvantage a student if they were are recently arrived from Haiti or the Dominican Republic, for example. I will, just in terms of the testing and evaluations for uh, multilingual learners where testing is required in their native language. A lot of times there aren't testing instruments that are normed for every population of student, depending on their language and their national origin. And so sometimes it depends on school districts, and school districts are really required to figure out, to be creative within their expertise of how to understand how students are learning and what students can do, to find ways using informal assessments, um, for example, where needed, where there aren't those testing instruments don't exist, to be able to assess students according to using the whisk or the Wyatt or the instruments that are commonly used to assess students. In addition to special education assessments, um, school districts are required to conduct English language proficiency assessments for students who are identified as multilingual learners or English learners. And I use those terms interchangeably. And I know in Massachusetts, we're kind of moving towards an asset-based language when referencing multilingual students to highlight um, that multilingualism as an asset. The law hasn't caught up to that, so why I sometimes also refer to English learners, because that is the law, at least in Massachusetts, referencing multilingual learners. So school districts are required to evaluate students who may be multilingual learners and may need additional support as they develop their English language proficiency, and they must monitor progress in terms of the student's English language proficiency. And this is regardless of the student's disability. In Massachusetts, we use the WIDA Access, for testing for grades K through 12. And there's some other tests that are used for early childhood multilingual learners or English learners. Multilingual nonverbal communicators. So if a student is nonverbal due to autism or an intellectual disability or another disability, but based on the home language, that student is a multilingual learner. They've mostly been exposed to a language that is not English. They must still be assessed in terms of their English language proficiency, and they're still entitled to receive instruction and additional support to be able to access the grade level content as a multilingual learner or an English learner. There are alternative English language proficiency assessments for students who have significant cognitive disabilities. This should be used really sparingly, um, and should be 1% of English learners or less. So this isn't, for students who have a communication impairment, or, a something like, who are deaf or hard of hearing, or, it's really students with significant cognitive disabilities that should be used for. And this is such a critical tool for families in the process of advocacy in the special education process. Um, where the parent disagrees with the school evaluations, they have a right to request an independent educational evaluation, also referred to as a second opinion to the school district evaluations. And families can request school district funding under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act for the independent educational evaluations. This is not a cure-all, in terms of for students accessing the services they need, and having their, what their individualized needs really are, having those needs identified. Um, it can be really hard to find multilingual evaluators. That's a huge issue in Massachusetts, and I'm sure in a lot of other states, is finding independent evaluators who can assess students in a language that's not English. So that can be a really challenging hurdle to overcome in getting that second opinion from the school district when there is a disagreement about what that student needs. Um, However, for immigrant families who may not have health insurance that funds private evaluations, um, I'm not all immigrant families, for example, in Massachusetts, even children have a form of Medicaid that will cover private evaluations. And so this is a tool that, again, everything under the umbrella of public education is uh, available to students regardless of their immigration status. And so that is something, whereas, health insurance and other or public health insurance and other public benefits, that may not be the case. So using this funding mechanism for an independent evaluation can make a big difference for students. Here we have the special education team meeting, and in Massachusetts, the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education recently issued some guidance that suggests a pre-meeting with parents, especially those who are unfamiliar with the U.S. school system. Um, and parents, of course, can invite anyone with knowledge of the student to the team meeting. And qualified interpreters, again, are required. At team meetings where the parent prefers to express themselves and to receive information in their native language. There should also be additional time given to team meetings, of course, where an interpreter is being used, especially if it's consecutive in interpretation. There's so many times where it's school districts can become very rigid in how meetings are scheduled and just how things are done in general. And so, oftentimes for a 3-year, reevaluation meeting, where there's an interpreter, who's going to be interpreting consecutively, an hour-long meeting it'll be next to impossible to get through everything and to provide the parent with an opportunity to raise their concerns and ask their questions in that period of time. Something that's also really important, and I will probably, after I'm done sharing my screen, I'll put some resources in the chat. Um, the U.S. Department of Education and Department of Justice in 2015 issued a Dear Colleague letter, which is, guidance to school districts um, and families. It's probably my favorite guidance ever that's ever been, government, guidance that's been issued. Um, and it focuses on addressing the educational needs of English learner students and their families and engaging their families. And it's something like 15 pages long, and it's just full of incredibly useful information. I will put that information in the chat and also some links to multilingual fact sheets that the US Department of Education and Department of Justice issued, kind of pulling from that guidance, that are shorter about the language rights of families who use interpretation and translation to communicate with their child's school, and also the rights of English learner students. But in something that comes out of that guidance that I've pulled here at the bottom in blue is that it's really critical that the IEP team include participants who have knowledge of the student's language needs and how to differentiate between the student's needs stemming from a disability or stemming from lack of English language proficiency. So that's always a question to ask. Who on that special education team can really differentiate in relation to that particular student, can really speak to that student's English language development and how it may intersect with that student's disability related needs. Um, So going on a little bit to the IEP for English learner students. Um, Actually, before this, because I think Ariana had sent a list of questions of um, kind of that participants had submitted before the webinar, and one of them was who should be included in the team, and to be able to speak to the needs of that student. And oftentimes, English language educators are put in kind of a separate category or separated from the special education team meeting. And so the team meeting, it could be one way where that communication can happen in terms of planning for the student. And it's where the IEP is developed. So I think, what some people had asked about were where in the IEP, English language educators should be included, or English learner educators should be included, ESL licensed educators, or others who are, supporting that student's English language needs. And, the answer to that is really based on the individual needs of the student. It's not a requirement that only uh, educators who are working on supporting that child in learning and addressing their disability related needs to learning are included in the IEP. It would be totally appropriate for there to be, for example, a consultation between the English learner educator and the special educator to be able to address the dual needs of that multilingual learner with a disability, and that could be part of the IEP, just to give one example of that. So going to the IEP for English learner students, where that student has needs related to their English language education, so they're an identified English learner, and they require individualized, specialized instruction and related services. So they're a student with a disability who requires an IEP. Where both of those, where those needs intersect, the English language education needs should be part of the IEP. So it would be impossible to separate those needs from that student, and the IEP should reflect that. So to give an example, I had a student a couple of years ago who had been in the United States for about 6 years, and he was an older student. He was I think, 10th grader, and he really wasn't making progress in terms of his English language proficiency. And he had kind of a moderate intellectual disability, um, and some other learning disability. But it was notable that he wasn't making progress as you would expect. Um, for a student of his age in terms of his English language proficiency. So we advocated for the school district to include a goal in his IEP that addresses English language proficiency and his progress in that area. That's just one example of a way in which the kind of the both needs, the English language education and the disability related needs kind of may intersect, and they should be both included in the IEP where that's the case. So the EL needs really infuse throughout the IEP, again, where that intersection is relevant to the individual needs of the student. Instruction in students' primary language, there should be there can be an educator who's qualified and experienced in addressing the student's language acquisition and disability related needs. And this can be, I mean, if you have that, unicorn who's, um, an ESL licensed special educator who's had, years of experience working with multilingual learners with disabilities. I mean, that's amazing. And they should get a huge raise, so that they stay in their position all the time and can be a resource to students and other educators. If that doesn't exist in the school district or in the school, it's appropriate for the EL staff or the EL teacher for a student to have regular consultation with a special educator or other educators who are working with that student so that they can have a coordinated plan for addressing the dual needs of that student so that that student is really able to make progress in their learning. It's so important to consider how skills will be used at home as a basis for native language instruction. We have a lot of students at Mass Advocates who are nonverbal communicators and use augmentative communication devices to speak, to communicate. Those devices often include apps that are available in multiple languages, for example, so that student can be carrying over their methods of communication in school that they're learning and developing to the home setting so that their family can also be working on their communication development. And just in some cases, it can, facilitate just having a relationship and, with that child and just being able to um, communicate, using words with that student, which of course will benefit everybody in so many ways. And these are just some issues to watch out for that I know we commonly see in assessment and IEP development for English learners. Um, we often see that special education teams won't recommend specialized support or instruction despite despite a child's unique needs because they're not readily available. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and at least in Massachusetts, our state special education law requires school districts to identify what that student needs, the individual needs of that student, that what services and supports, instruction they need to be able to make progress in school. And so determinations regarding how much services will cost, what programs are available in the school district really shouldn't come into play in those determinations. So teams should really be focused on what that student needs, and then the next step, figuring out how to be able to provide those supports. We often see that the English language education needs are overlooked for English learners in segregated special education settings. So for students who are in separate day programs or, I mean, residential programs even, or substantially separate classrooms. And I'm not sure that those same terms are used in other states, but essentially segregated special education settings outside of the general education setting are overlooked. And so that student, will be in a classroom and receiving, services to address their disability related needs, but won't be receiving any English language education supports. And that is illegal. That student is entitled to be receiving both. And um, ideally, it shouldn't be a compliance driven thing. Ideally, it should be kind of a collaboration between the staff who are providing the English language education and the staff who are providing the special education services. School districts don't assess English language proficiency for nonverbal communicators. And this is so many times we see this is because they don't know how. Like, well, he doesn't talk, so how can we assess um, his English language proficiency? And school districts, they're different tools, they're different experts who have spent a lot of time and to determining ways to assess receptive language, for example, and that student's way of communicating and their language proficiency in different ways, um, and so that it should still be happening. We often see delays when there's a multilingual learner who's suspected to have a disability, and kind of a wait and see to see, well, is it the language? Is it the disability? And this can go on for as much as even 2 years in some school districts, or more. So that student has to wait that long if they do have a disability to receive what they need to be able to learn in school. And then we oftentimes see no communication with the home to learn how the student is accessing languages in different settings. So that is such crucial information for the team to understand, to be able to effectively support the student. And yet we oftentimes don't, it's just not happening. Or there may be, the special educator is communicating with the home, but the educator who has the expertise in terms of English language acquisition isn't connecting with the home. And so there's just an overall disconnect to the detriment of the student. I'm going to skip a little bit. I think because I know I'm running out of time. But we have the problem resolution options beyond the team process. Um, and in Massachusetts, we have a helpline, our MAC helpline, to help with these options that's free that families can call, including mediation, an appeal to the administrative agency that adjudicates special education matters. In Massachusetts, is the Bureau of Special Education Appeals. Each state is required to have a complaint system. In Massachusetts, this is the problem resolution system, which is pretty user-friendly for families, and you can even submit a complaint on your phone using their electronic form. And then we have the United States Office of Civil Rights as well. Um, these are some resources that we have, and I'm happy to provide the slides after. We have some videos about the special education process, and one that's immigrants and special education. The second video, which focuses on immigrant rights and special education, which essentially are the same rights as any student, regardless of where they were born, to special education and public education. And then some guidance here, and I am going to put in the chat some really useful guidance documents from, I'm going to put federal agency documents because I know that there are a lot of people on the webinar who are from other states. Thank you so much.